Welcome everybody. We'll be talking about week 3 content today. We'll just be talking about this first portion, and then on Wednesday we'll follow up with explaining Sneaky in more detail. For the first half of this week, you'll just be working on expanding our nav agents functionality and actually adding a manager so we can individually select the nav agents and issue them different commands. So there's the instructions right here, which you can go ahead and follow. There's also another Unity package with this, so we can open that up. And we'll take a look at what's included and just go over some of the stuff inside of it. Let me close out of some of this. Download, yep. Opening up that package. Sorry, one second. Let me just load that real quick. There's just a package. Now, when you import a package, just like when we imported the nav agents package the first time, we need to create a project. So we'll open up our Unity Hub. And we'll just create a new project. Got to give the project a name. We'll call this Agents W Manager. So Agents with a Manager. Or just Agents Manager. That'll be fine. You can go ahead and create that. And wait for Unity to load up. So this package will have the state machine and everything in it. We just created an empty project. We can go ahead and import our package now. So from our zipped folder that we downloaded, just double click the package to open it. And we can import. It'll import everything. Big thing that we're going to want to do is make sure that we actually open up the scene that was included in the package. And that's in our nav agents scenes folder. You can open up that, and that should look quite familiar from the last experiment that we were working on. We can press play and check out what's in here. If we press space, it's got that pause functionality added in for us. So it's just going to navigate through and use the nav agent state machine best to just go through the different objects. We can stop playing and take a look at how things are set up. So in our nav agents, we have a scripts folder. There's the one for the nav point, just to get it navigating around, and then the state machine itself. In here, the only thing different from just the normal nav agents is that it does have the pause state added for you. And their helper function that they created was just called pause. And that'll pause it or return to the previous state, just like we set up in our last lecture. Then they've overridden the update, making sure to update the state machine. And then checking when space is pressed, we'll go ahead and pause any of the agents with this script. So we're going to change this up and take a look at how we could have a manager being able to select different agents from the scene. Now, if you do just follow along with that, that's perfectly fine, and it does show you kind of how to get all that set up. I'm going to show you a similar way, just with slight differences in case you do get stuck anywhere in the documents. So first thing that we'll need to do is make sure that we have a new script to work with that can hold the different nav agents. I'm going to go ahead and close out of that. So we're going to create an empty object, and we'll go ahead and rename this object to Agent Manager. And then add a, let's go ahead and just add a script to our scripts folder, so we're not just adding it at the base assets folder. We'll create a new script for it. And this will be Agent Manager. before I forget, we can go ahead and make sure that the script is attached to our object so that it tries to run when the game starts. Our agent manager, there's a few things we'll need. We'll need this manager to actually hold a list or an array of all the agents in the scene. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. First way would just be creating an array of just game objects that we can go ahead and populate in the editor. We could have that be serialized. So we could take a look at how that could be done. So serialize a field. And we'll just do a base of game object, or type of game object rather. And we'll call this agents. And just for safety, I'll just set that to null so we don't get any warnings or anything from it. If we save this, going back to Unity, let it load up. With our game object selected, we see that we can change the size of this. Let's say we currently only have one in the level, so we're going to need to do a couple of things for that in a moment. But if we take a look at what element we can select, we can choose any game object from the scene. So because I have this type set to game object, it'll allow me to set or add any game object to this array. Now that's not too great because this is supposed to only manage agents. It shouldn't be having things like the nav points added to our array here. What we want to do, instead of just doing a base game object, we can make this more specific. So instead of that, we can specify specifically our nav agent state machine best. That is our agent script. So we can have an array of those components instead. If we change that type of the array, we now have direct access to the agents themselves rather than having to get the component of the script anytime we want to interact with it. It also cleans up when we're trying to select or add to this list. It'll only show nav agents that we have from the scene as selectable. So we can select our nav agent. And if we were to create more nav agents, which before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and just create this nav agent as a prefab. We can then drop more prefabs in, like so. So we have 3 different agents in there. Our agent manager would then have to change how many agents it holds to 3. And we can select that sub 1 for the second one and sub 2 for the third one. So we've got an array with 3 of these in there. If we play this right now, we'll see our other agents don't know which nav points to go to, so we're going to get an error because I just kind of copied them into a prefab, and the prefab doesn't have all of the nav points assigned. So we're going to have to make sure that we do assign the different nav points. Let's have this one go to first one, or to sub 1, sub 2, sub 3, and then finally nav point 0. And this one, whoops, got to select them from the scene view, not the game view. We'll just give them some nav points. Let's say this one's only going to go back and forth between sub 2 and sub 3. And we could even change its size to 2. So it's only got 2 nav points for that one. Now that each one of them has nav points assigned, they should go and navigate around to those different points. And we'll even see them navigate around each other to avoid just running straight at each other and colliding like crazy. All right. So we now need some sort of way to be able to select these different, to have one active at a time so we can interact with just one at a time. Right now, if I were to play and if I press space, because they're all running that script, the agent script, and the agent script itself is checking if we press space, it's going to pause all of them at once or unpause all of them at once. We're going to move our input from the agent script over to our manager script. Before that, we need to be able to select individual ones. So what we can do is, since we have an array, we can just store an index into an integer. And we'll call this cur agent index. And this will represent our currently selected agent. And we'll set that to -1, saying that it defaults with none of them selected. We can then start thinking about our update and have some inputs to select and swap between them. We'll go for just pressing the right arrow to select the next agent in the list. So if our input get key down key code right arrow, when we press that, we'll say our current selected agent or our current index, cur agent index. We'll bump that up by 1. We then need a separate input press. So outside of that input check for right arrow, we'll add another input check. Get key down, and this time we'll use key code, and we'll go for alpha 1, which is just the number keys up at the top row. When we press alpha 1, well, we can talk to our currently selected agent from our list. So we'll say agents sub cur agents index. And straight from there, if I press dot, we see we have access to all the state machine functions as well as anything we've made from our on the nav agent script, such as this pause is made public. So let's look for pause. Pause. All right. And before I forget, since we're moving our input to our manager now, we'd want to go to our agent scripts or agent class. And we can go to the update and just get rid of all this code to have the agent run this code. We want all our input to be done through the manager. I'm going to just comment that out, Control KC to comment that out, so that only our agent manager is running those input stuff. If we go ahead and play, and if we just try and press 1 right now, we see index out of range exception, index was out of bounds of the array. So let's stop. Let's take a look at that. So did the input check, I had pressed 1, so it's going to run this if. It's telling the current agent to pause. Well, let's actually attach and debug and find out why it's giving us an error. If we play again, and I try and press 1 before doing anything else, we see we get that error. And why did that not? Oh, because I didn't have any breakpoints. we're going to want to put a breakpoint there and actually debug what's happening when we press 1. There we go, we're paused. We got 1 pressed, and then we're checking agents, which has 3 agents in it. I'm going to just pin these agents real quick to keep it simple. So agents sub 0, sub 1, and sub 2. But we're saying access agents, and the index we're using is -1. So right now the index is invalid. We don't have anything selected. So that's why it's accessing null, because, well, -1 is out of the range of the agents. It only goes 0, 1, or 2. So we're going to have to change that a little bit. And we can add some safety code here. We'll say only run this if our current agent index is greater than or equal to 0. All right. Go ahead and save that. And let's check this out again. We press play, press 1, and nothing's happening. So nothing, no codes, but we're also not pausing anything because we don't have one selected, but we're not getting an error. So if I press the right arrow key, we don't get any player feedback. I just pressed it. I'm not sure if the mic picked it up or not, but we can't see what is currently selected. So we'll go into that in a moment, but I do have one selected now. And I'll wait till they're all moving. If I press 1, we do see it actually paused. If I press right arrow again, we've selected a different agent. If I press 1, it's going to pause that other agent. If I press right one more time, we can pause that one. If we press right one again, once again, and press 1, we're getting an out of bounds array. So this is at the other bound of the array where it's incremented that number to the point where it's past the end of the array. If we wanted to see which one of these is currently selected, with our agent manager selected, we can go ahead and change that to debug. And we'll even see private variables in our inspector view. So we see it's current agent sub 3. Sub 3 doesn't exist. We only have 0, 1, and 2. So we're going to have to add that upper bound protection. Similar to when we first got these agents working, when it hit that very last one, we want it to loop back at the beginning. So we're going to have to do a check every time we increment. We'll check if our current agent index is greater than or equal to our array's length. If that's true, we'll go ahead and just set that current index to be right at the beginning of the array, sub 0. So we've got our lower bound protection and our upper bound protection right here. And once again, I'm gonna probably want to add like either a print string or something, but print strings are only useful for as a developer to see which agent is selected and stuff. But when you release the game, you can't see any of the print strings from the play view. You don't have like a console running alongside the game that you pull up and check. It'd be a pretty bad game if you have to check an output log every time you do an action. So let's make it so that we can see something when it is selected. So we've created a prefab from our nav agent. Let's add some visual component on them to make them stand out from just a cylinder and actually show something else when it is selected. So here's where I'm going to diverge a little bit from the documents. They have you create a highlight cylinder and then play around with that. I'm going to go ahead and just add an empty object. And what we're going to do with this object is we're going to add a light to it. I could have just added a point light as an object straight to our nav agent. So we're going to set this a little bit differently than how the document will guide you through. All of them have these point lights on. We'll say that this component is turned off by default. Or, well, let's just change the color since the light to black by default. So black is just no light when you're talking about lights. So no light to start. And let's go ahead and rename this to our highlight. Appropriate that it's got a light attached, that's perfectly fine. And back to our actual script, we'd want to have some way of turning this light on or off. So this is currently attached to our nav agents. Our nav agent script is attached to this. So there's a few different ways we could do it. We could, I'm going to turn off debugging so it doesn't have all the extra stuff in here. We could add a serialized field here where we can set what our highlight object is and turn it on or off as needed. Or we can go ahead and actually get it from code. So first thing I want to do is make sure that's saved because I didn't save that. So our agent script is running this one. I'd want to add some sort of interface in here or helper function, just like we have pause that our manager can call for it to toggle the light on or off or set its highlight. We'd want this public so that our manager can call it. We don't need to return anything, so we'll avoid return type. And we'll go ahead and call it, let's just call it highlight. And there's several different ways we can try and get access to that child object's light component. So because the game object that this script is attached to doesn't have direct access to the other game object, as I mentioned, could set it up in the editor, have a serialized field of that game object, but that's not a great way to do it. So I'm going to just have our ask our game object for its transform, and we can access the children from that. So any child objects, we can specify what index we want. We know it's only got one child, and it's going to have that light object as that child. So getting that child's transform, we can ask it for its game object. And then get any components from that child object that we want. The documents will have you get the component of the renderer for that highlight cylinder. And I don't want to pass string, we'll do the type component. We'll be looking for a light. And we'll go ahead and say enabled. We want it to be whatever the opposite it is currently. Well, if we take a look at how our pause is working, we created a variable to track whether it's currently on or off. We'd want to do the same thing here. We'll just create a bool for highlight. We'll initialize it to false. And we're basically using this as a reference of how to set that up. So very similar to the pause function, just instead of changing states and stuff, it's just going to turn the light on or off. And for that, we'll go ahead and toggle the bool value. So we'll say highlight equals not highlight. If highlight is true, we would want to turn that highlight on And just get rid of some of these spaces. And since it's only one line, we'll say enabled equals, oh, and I didn't do the enabled. I forgot I changed the color to black. So we'll be changing the color of this light to just white. Or make it a little more interesting. Let's go ahead and set it to blue. And otherwise, or else, we'll want to set it back to black, so turning the light off. The document will have you just change colors of that highlight cylinder that it has you create. I just wanted to show you a different way of accessing a different type of component. Same concepts can be applied to either. So we now have this function that when we call it, it will toggle highlight. If the highlight's on, it'll have a blue light. If it's off, it'll have a black light. We then need some way of calling this function, or, well, we've created the function, but we need to call it somewhere. Right now it's got 0 references, so nowhere in code is it being called. Our agent manager, we can have it call it whenever it selects one of the agents. So after our increment, after we press right arrow, it'll change what is our current agent. Let's access this current agent after it's been updated using our updated index. And we can call that highlight function. So let's take a look at this. If we go ahead and play this, if I press right arrow, there is a highlight on there. It's not very intense, so let me make that a little bit better. Intensity. Let's go for a 3 times intensity. Yeah, so we've got a little bit of a highlight on that agent. And if I really wanted to make it different, we could go ahead back to our scene and turn our directional light intensity, make our scene a bit darker so it's really going to stand out. Press that right arrow. There we go. If we press the right arrow again, it just turned on the new one that we selected. If I press 1, we see this one's the one that's selected, but we never turned off the old one. So we're going to have to do something to make sure that it deselects whatever we have before selecting a new one. So our agent manager, before we change which one we have selected, we'd want to do the same protection like if we don't have any selected. So making sure that if we do have one selected, if that's greater than or equal to 0, that means we've got one from our list. We can tell it to toggle its highlight. So this is going to turn off currently selected. This is going to actually do the increment. So change currently selected. And this very last one is turn on newly selected. So we have 2 actions that are both doing the same code, but they're actually affecting different agents because we're changing which one we're referencing right here. And let's make sure this is all working. If we play, select that first one. If we press right again, we've got that second one. Press right a third time, we're on the third one. If we issue it a command, it only affects that single agent. And we can keep pressing right to loop through all of them. All right. So one other thing that I want to do is, what if we had like a list of 20 agents and pressing right arrow one too many times selects the wrong agent, and you wanted to just go left? Well, you could simply add that in as another input press. If our input dot get key down, key code, left arrow, and it's going to be kind of similar to this, so I can use that as a reference and give us a starting base. So if we do have one selected, turn off the one that's already selected. But right here, I don't want to increase, or increment, I'd want to do a decrement. So minus minus. So this is going to count down from whatever we're at. Then our safety check to see if we've reached past the end of the array isn't going to work so well here, because this is expecting that new number to be higher. What we can do is saying if this is less than 0, that means we've gone past the bottom. We've gone into negative values. Instead of setting it right back to the beginning and keeping it just always selecting that first agent whenever we press it, I'd want to change this to be the very last element in the array. So we can ask our agents for the length, but our length isn't necessarily the last element. Remember, when we were first working through this and I pressed right 3 times, our current agent index was set to 3, which is the same as length, but that's invalid. That's past sub 2. So we'd want to make sure to say -1, because whatever our length is, the very last element in the array will be length -1. We now should be able to go forward or backward through this array. And we can take a look at that in game. So we press right, 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 and we can keep going in that triangle. If we press left, we go backwards through the array. So that's just a couple of things I wanted to point out of how that can work. One other thing I'll go ahead and show you guys is in our agent manager, if we did have this set up and not having direct access to the script and we're just doing it the game object way, if we're storing game objects instead, we'll notice we can't access just .highlight straight from the agent's sub whatever, because that's just a game object. We'd have to actually get the component of the state machine, and that's nav agent state machine best. Oops. Before we actually have access to that script. So that's just something to take into account, which I believe the documents do show you how to set it up that way instead. So that's the highlights and the pause as well. Oh. And I got 2 dots over here. So we'd have to use that anytime we want to talk to the script. One other thing I want to show is, well, I guess we could see this, how that's working. Agent manager, because I changed the type, we will have to assign these again. Anytime you change the type, you have to select it from the list again. We'll just go ahead and select the agents. And make sure I can still interact with them. So still interacts with them perfectly fine. But obviously, doing that multiple times in code is just kind of an unnecessary step. So might as well just store that script access directly by having it be an array of these scripts rather than just an array of the game objects, because it bloats the code quite a bit. The other thing we can check out is, rather than having direct access like this to get access to our child's light or child object and stuff, the documents do mention to set up a serialized field for that highlight object. And we'll just call it highlight geo for game object. Oh, and the type, obviously, is a game object. Initialize it to null so we don't get any warnings like that one's given us a warning. We'll just pop that away. All right. So we've got this, but we're never using it. We can go ahead and try and use that instead. And way down here, rather than getting it from the transform to access that game object, we could have it highlight game object. So we're getting that game object's light component. We'll change this one as well. Highlight geo. One big thing about this is now we have to make sure to assign that in the editor. Otherwise, it won't know what game object you're talking about. This is just some variable we initialize to nothing. So in the editor, I could go through the scene and actually assign their individual game objects from the scene like this. That's not a great way to do it. We do have the prefab though. And our prefab can actually be assigned to any child objects you have. We'll say that this will set it to our highlight. And it will work the same way in game now. If we check this out, we've got that assigned, press right, and it is still affecting it properly. I just wanted to show you the way to get to access to it from code versus just doing it through a serialized field in the editor. So, are there any questions about how we're doing access to any of these objects, or how the array is actually being incremented anytime we press right, decremented when we press left, stuff like that?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Well, that's about it for today's lecture. I'll go ahead and leave the session open for another half hour or so, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop up and talk about it.